much for an interesting presentation to bring us up to date on labor law in Kyrgyzstan. So we'll move on next to our second presenter, Tanika. Do you have slides?
Yeah, I'll just share my screen.
Okay, our second presenter is Tanika Chakraborty on talking about temporary international migration and shocks.
Thanks, Becky. This paper goes back, the history, my association with LIK goes back all the way to 2009, 10, 11, 12, when I was at TIW Berlin. And this project was underway, the LIK project. And this was a paper that I wrote actually after coming back to India. The first paper I wrote on LIK, using the LIK data and around the same topic issue when I was at Berlin, in Berlin. So as this title suggests, this paper is about temporary migration and shocks. I'm sure all of us are aware of the very big literature on migration and shocks, right? How migration decisions are affected by the occurrence of shocks, particularly agricultural shocks. And I just cite a few papers over here, but there is, of course, a whole lot more in general. And when we are talking about migration in general, it could be international migration, it could be domestic migration, it could be temporary, it could be permanent, so on and so forth. So agricultural shocks, direct income shocks, weather shocks. So, but the idea is that the entire literature, except for just one paper, which is Halliday in 2006, they don't distinguish between different types of shocks. And most papers actually, and in fact, rather all papers apart from Halliday that we came across, they consider one shock at a time. They do not consider the different types of shocks that a household can face. And hence, there's a simultaneous sort of effect of different shocks, which could go in different directions, as I'll show you later. And what we see is kind of like an interaction of all these shocks, possibly with each other, and the net result on migration. Right? So as I said, this distinction is important, as a natural shock might reduce or increase migration. So the direction of the effect might vary depending on several, let's say, local conditions, right? So those local conditions could be how the labor markets are. It could be the kind of liquidity constraints faced by the households, right? Depending on whether they're in rural regions, urban regions, formal, informal financial markets, how well developed they are, and so on. And also the employment activities available to a household. So what we do in this paper is essentially look at how different types of natural shocks affect the migration decision. And specifically, we ask in three different levels, we basically estimate the effect of natural shock on households' decision to migrate. So the first thing is that we restrict to natural shocks only for multiple reasons. So one is, of course, that natural shocks are potentially the most exogenous of shocks that a household faces. Health shocks, different types of employment shocks, etc. These are more likely to be endogenous. And then, since weather shocks are more likely to affect the livelihood of rural households, right? Because these are the households which are engaged in agricultural and related activities like livestock maintenance, etc., raising livestock, etc. We restrict our analysis to rural households. Okay? The second is that we are particularly interested in the dynamics of temporary migration and not so much of permanent migration, because, as I said, the literature is big on permanent migration, but more importantly, LIK provides a unique opportunity to study temporary migration, because there is a lot of temporary migration from Kyrgyzstan to Russia, and also international temporary migration. And also, because it's a panel, it allows us to see the dynamics, the changes within the same house, right? So we distinguish actually, in contrast to most of the prevalent literature, we distinguish between return and onward migration within a household. For return migration decision, basically what we do is we compare two households. So this is talking more about our identification strategy. We compare two households who both have a migrant in the current period and study the change in their migration status in the next period and how that change responds to shock experiences of the household. And then we examine whether shocks act as a pull or push factor. So this is basically the idea behind the return and onward migration. Finally, we also look at, we try to suggest something about the mechanisms, underlying mechanisms. So how does migration respond to access to informal finance, informal borrowing options of households, and how does local labor, so as I said, it depends how the shocks affect a household's migration decision depends on local conditions, and two foremost being the local labor market, employment opportunities, etc. The second is also the informal or more generally the financial options, right? The borrowing options, financial market of that the household faces. Okay. So very quickly, our contribution can be lined up as possibly one of the few papers to look at temporary international migration, which also distinguishes between return and ongoing migration, which thanks to LIK data, which allows us to do it in addition to the panel nature of the data, allowing us to address unobserved heterogeneity. And then we also establish that it is important to distinguish between the different types of shocks that we simultaneously consider in the same decision problem, that depending on, as I keep on saying, depending on the local market, labor markets. Right? Because, so for instance, consider this particular example, and I'll show more of it later, that drought shocks, for instance, or which affects agricultural activity. So in a region where households' main employment is in agriculture and related activities, a drought shock is likely to reduce income. And when it reduces income, it is basically likely to encourage out migration when migration is used as a risk mitigation strategy, meaning that there are few or no other options of risk mitigation of this income drop. And what are these other options? These other options are primarily, as most of the rural developing country contexts are, informal borrowings. Okay? The second is winter shocks. Now, winter shocks are a little bit different than drought shocks, particularly, and this is where I also possibly need all of your inputs because it requires the context of Kyrgyzstan. But from what we understood by reading the larger literature is that winter is not a time when agriculture or harvesting seasons are, or agriculture is done to a great extent, or even livestock, for instance, are not really reared at that time. And rather in winter, what happens is within the household, there's a lot of requirement of labor, household labor. In rural areas, possibly collection of woods, etc., to warm up the house and so on and so forth. And this creates an adverse labor situation, which means that the households would have to call back the migrants or not send the migrants. So basically different types of natural shocks affecting migration decision in two different directions. So the data, of course, comes from LIK. I don't need to tell you much about LIK and the panel data that we construct, which is there in LIK, and we combine different schedules of the data, particularly the ones that provide information on household demographics, migration information, assets, education, shocks received, and finally informal borrowing opportunity. And so just to give you an idea of our sample, so this is the fraction, as you see, of migrant households in that we observe in our data. International migrants, these are all, because we only consider international migrants here. And this is the typical migrant household. Right? So household size is roughly 6.45. There are more adults in a migrant household than in non-migrant households. Number of elderly people are much more in non-migrant households. Then there is a little bit of difference in education. Again, wealth is towards the lower deciles. You can see that there's a difference in wealth also. Right? So what we do is we control for all these variables, apart from the household fixed effects, of course. So next, what is also important for us is, as I said, that we consider both the onward migration and the return migration. So how do we define onward migration? So onward migration is if a household has migrant in the current year, but were non-migrants in the previous year. Right? The standard, whatever we call migration. Return migration is migrants in the previous year, but non-migrant in the current year. And what you see over here, although large chunk of households are either non-migrants at all in all the rounds, or they are always migrants, so permanent migrants, in other words, at least during the range of this particular data, we do have sufficient variation in this 0 to 1 and 1 to 0 switches. And remember, even when we do not distinguish between return and onward migration, these are the switches that let us identify the story that we are trying to tell, right? So, so considerable changes in migration status of households over the period of our analysis. Finally, we come to the shocks that we use for our study. So we use these 5 types of shocks in the data: drought, rain and landslide, winter and frost, and earthquake and pest. Again, as you can see, there is quite a bit of variation in the occurrence of this shock or experience of this shock across the households. Roughly, these are the means. So this is the standard fixed effects model that we estimate the household's migration decision, the different types of the 5 different types of shocks that they face, each household I in region J and time t-1. So because of simultaneity concerns, we take shocks from the previous period and migration decision in the current period. And then there are these region fixed effects and time fixed effects, region time linear effects, and so on and so forth, right? In addition to all the controls that I already showed you. So what we find is just a few slides on what we find is that, as we expect, as I said earlier, the drought is a shock that tends to reduce incomes, right? It's likely to reduce incomes by reducing agricultural output in rural regions. So what we find over here, the dependent variable is migration, net migration, remember. So here what we find is with clusters, year oblast effects, household fixed effects, and household level controls, we find that it increases migration. On the other hand, winter shocks reduce migration. Right? So this is the main result that we find. And one more thing I want to point out possibly is that when we introduce these shocks independently, or whether we introduce them together, the effects actually do not vary much, which also suggests that the shocks are not really correlated with each other, because these are natural shocks. These are likely to be independent of each other as well. Now, the second part that so the return and ongoing migration, onward migration, so recall and sending decisions of households. And once again, what you can see over here is that so sending, which is onward migration, out migration, increases when there's a drought shock. That out migration actually is 0 when there is the coefficient size is also 0 when there is a winter shock, a cold shock. However, when there is a cold shock, as you can see the recall, we don't have a significant result here because the number of observations are also very low. And on top of that, we cluster and all those things. This is a pretty high magnitude. Right? So meaning that recall of migrants is much more when there is a cold wave or a cold shock, not so much of a drought effect. So here we try to show the mechanism part. Right. So what I was saying earlier is that that we expect that in winter months, labor requirement at home increases particularly in rural Kyrgyzstan, you have to arrange for a lot of household stuff. And this is what we find using the time use data in LIK, time use survey in LIK. This is housing repair, right, which is very labor intensive. On the other hand, these are activities which are not that labor intensive, right? Eat, sleep, laundry. And what you find is between winter and non-winter months, the average time spent on eat, sleep, laundry is basically the same. But the average time spent on these labor-intensive activities is way more in winter months than in summer months. Okay, so labor-intensive tasks much more in winter. Yeah, that is.
Did you 5 minutes?
Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so labor-intensive tasks are much more in winter and absence of markets for houses. So this is something we assume, again, something I want your feedback on. We assume that households cannot really buy this labor in the market, that arranging for repairs, housing, etc., all kinds of household activities. And hence, they have to recall the adult workers, adult members of the household from the migration status. And finally, what we do is we try to see how does availability of informal borrowing affect this migration decision in the presence of shocks. Because see, when a household experiences a shock, there are two ways, I mean, there could be other ways, but consider two ways that the household can mitigate this shock. One is it can borrow from a neighbor or a friend or a relative, or it can migrate, right? Both are in some senses mitigating strategies. What we find is when the household has access to finance, informal finance, this is easy finance, easy access to finance, the response of migration is actually lower. So when there is a drought shock, a migration increases, but that increase is much lower when the household has access to easy finance, which kind of also supports our story that this is indeed an income effect that we are seeing here. On the other hand, because winter is not an income effect, but rather the labor effect, we do not find that mitigating effect of informal borrowing sources on this particular variable. Right? So again, earthquake did not show up to be significant in our main regression. The net effect is possibly because, as you can see, it increases when there is an earthquake, but again decreases quite a bit when there is easy finance available. So that that kind of concludes what we find. A drought shock raises onward migration, and we think that this is the income effect working over here. So it increases migration. On the other hand, a winter shock increases return migration because that's where the labor effect is working. Okay, I'm done. That's all.
Thank you very much. Another really good presentation. So we'll move on to our third presentation. Wolfgang, do you want to get your slides up there?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Catherine. Let me try to share my screen.
So our third presenter is Wolfgang Sojitz, and he's going to talk about a real important issue, unlearning during a pandemic in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you see my slides okay? Yeah?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, brilliant. As Catherine just said, I'm going to talk about impacts of the pandemic on learning in Kyrgyzstan. This is joint work with Oscar Diaz-Bodilla from the Paris School of Economics, and my ISTC colleagues Damir Esenaliyev and Tilman Brook, who should also be in the room. To sort of motivate this paper, there's a well-documented learning crisis in lower middle income countries. About two and a half years ago, another crisis hit the entire globe, the COVID pandemic, as we all know, and that strongly disrupted education and societies more generally. And what seems clear is that the learning impacts of the COVID pandemic are quite complex, but so far not that well understood. There is a growing body of evidence, but the strongest evidence comes from high-income countries. But what seems very obvious is that we definitely need to improve our understanding of the impacts of the pandemic on learning outcomes in low and middle income countries. And we are trying to address this gap in this paper by studying the impacts of the pandemic on learning outcomes in Kyrgyzstan. We studied 2 waves of panel survey data from a sample of 1,155 children from 154 schools all over the country. The data were collected by Mercy Corps. And so the first survey took place just before the pandemic hit in December 2019. And we surveyed children who were in grade 2 at the time. And the mean age of the surveyed children was 7.6. And then in the second survey, we surveyed the exact same children. So that was during the pandemic. And by that time, children were in grade 3. And they were now about 9 years old, okay? So this is just an overview of what I just said. So we have a baseline that happened just before the pandemic started, and then we have another wave of panel survey data from 1.5 years later, okay? So what do we do in this paper? So we study literacy outcomes as our main outcomes. And in order to do that, we study results from a literacy test, which was the exact same in the 2 survey waves. So, okay, so we have panel data from this large sample of children who took the exact same tests twice. Okay, and in addition, we collected a range of many other socioeconomic variables, and that also included variables capturing how households and individuals were exposed to the pandemic. And then all I'm going to show you is very descriptive, so nothing causal here, but we think that this is still really, really interesting. So based on our data structure, we can provide descriptive analyses of within child changes in literacy over time, because we have data from the exact same literacy tests. And in addition to that, we can use our rich data to try to shed light on heterogeneity in these changes, and also try to understand the mechanisms driving these changes. Okay, so let me jump right to our main result, which is that on average, literacy decreased. Okay, what does that mean? If we compare the mean literacy skills in survey 2 to the mean literacy in survey 1, we find that the mean literacy score in the second survey is significantly lower than in the first survey. Okay, so that's statistically significant, which was quite shocking to us, frankly. And if we look at that in a bit more detail, so we can look at this graph. And what we do here is we group students in terms of how much their literacy score changed. So what these bars here mean, that for example, if we start with the tallest bar, for about 44% of our children, there was a modest increase in their literacy skills. Okay, but moving to the left means that for all children left of this bar, so starting from here, that means that their literacy score actually decreased, okay? And expressed in terms of standard deviations of the baseline distribution, we see that there's, for more than 10% of children, there was a really strong decrease in their literacy score of more than 1 standard deviation, okay? Which is really, really worrying. Okay, what we did here was we sorted children based on their literacy score in the first wave. Okay, so if we start on the right, these are the children who had the best literacy skills in survey wave 1, and moving to the left, this is the full spectrum, and at the very left, these are the children which had the worst literacy scores. Okay, and so we grouped children into these 10 groups, and what we see is a really striking pattern. Okay, so what these bars mean is that for those children who had the best literacy scores, we also observe the biggest drop in literacy. Okay, so their score decreased the most compared to other groups. And once we move to children who performed less well in the first wave, we see that these losses in literacy become smaller. And for those who actually did not very well in the first round, we see a slight increase. Okay, so a very strong pattern. And so in addition to that, what we then did was we tried to look at certain factors that can help us understand some of the heterogeneity and the mechanisms behind it, behind these patterns that we see. And so we studied two sets of factors that are, of course, related to each other. So one set of factors is related to schooling, such as school closures and the measures of the degree of homeschooling that children received. And then there's another important set of factors that we study, which are factors at the household level. So we have a wide array of variables on the socioeconomic status at the household level, and also on shocks that households experienced during the pandemic. So that covers various dimensions, including health, education, assets, and income, among others. Okay, starting with schooling. The first type of analysis we did was we classified schools in terms of the duration for which they were closed during the pandemic. And so what we see here, these are three groups of schools. So this group of schools were closed for less than 2 months. This group of schools, these schools were closed for 2 to 4 months, and the third group of schools were closed for more than 4 months. Okay, and these bars again indicate the change in the literacy score. So the 0 is here. So anything that's below 0 means that literacy decreased. And what we see is that for those schools, children in those schools that were closed for more than 4 months, the literacy losses were significantly larger than in other schools that were only closed for shorter periods. Okay, and then this is another measure of actually going to school. This is at the child level, and so the gray bar are the children that were sent back to school when a school reopened. But there's also other children who were not sent back to school, and this is the gray bar. These are children who were not sent back to schools immediately when they reopened, and these are children who were sent back to school immediately when they reopened. And what we see is that those children who were not sent back to school immediately when they reopened also had significantly larger losses in terms of literacy compared to children who were not immediately sent back to school. And then looking at homeschooling, we can do similar analyses. So in the figure on the left, we group children in terms of how much help they get with studies at home. So this is a measure reported by caregivers. So they were asked whether or not children get help with their studies at home. So the green bar are the children where caregivers reported, yes, children get help with studies at home, and the gray bar is for children where caregivers reported that children do not get much help with studies at home. And what we see is, again, a very striking pattern among those children who do not get help with studies at home. The losses in literacy were significantly larger than among those children who do get help with studies at home. And we also collected data on the actual number of hours of homeschooling per day. And again, we see a very similar pattern that's consistent with what we see on the left, which is that there's a strong correlation between the number of hours of homeschooling per day and the degree to which the literacy score decreased. To be more precise, the more hours of homeschooling were provided to the child, the smaller or the less harmful the impact of the pandemic was in terms of the literacy score, which is also what something would expect. Okay, then moving on to household level factors. As I said, we have a large set of variables capturing socioeconomic status and shocks, including COVID shocks. What we did here is that we calculated a wealth index based on the assets of a household. And again, we see a very strong pattern, a very strong correlation between the wealth of a household and the size of the losses in literacy. And what we see here is that now in this group, these are the children who were affected the most, who had the largest decreases in literacy. And these are precisely the children that live in the poorest households, okay? So we see a very strong pattern that losses in literacy are concentrated among poorer households. Interestingly, when we look at not the level, but whether or not a household reports having experienced an income shock since the start of a pandemic, we do not see much of a difference. Okay, so it seems to be more at the level rather than whether or not a household experienced a shock. But this is very speculative, obviously. And then we also tried to look at the role of the demographic factors of other household members. So on the left, we grouped children in terms of the number of siblings they have that are in school age. Okay, so the gray bar, this is for the children who do not have siblings in school age, and the green bar is for children who do have siblings in school age. And we see that for children who do have siblings in school age, the harmful impacts of the pandemic on literacy are less severe, okay? Which is what we see in the difference between the height of these two bars. However, there's a lot of variation, and the difference is not statistically significant. And we see a very similar pattern when we look at the education level of the child's mother. Again, so for this group, these are children where their mother has no tertiary education, and this is for children when the mother does have tertiary education. Again, we see this pattern that for more highly educated mothers, the losses we see in terms of literacy among children are less severe. However, there's a lot of variation, and the difference is not statistically significant. Okay, and then as I said, we also tried to capture how much households were actually exposed to the actual disease or the virus, if you like. And so again, we grouped households based on a survey question that asked them whether or not they knew someone who was ill or died from COVID. And the green bar is for that group of households who reported that they actually do know someone who got very ill or died from COVID. And the gray bar is for those households that said, no, we do not know someone who was severely ill or died from COVID. And again, we see a strong difference, and this difference is statistically significant. So for households where caregivers report that they know someone who was severely ill or died from COVID, the losses in the literacy score of the children are significantly more pronounced compared to households who were not exposed, if not that much exposed, if you will, to the virus as these other households. Okay, while this is all descriptive results. We believe that our results are quite clear and very striking. So and sad as well. So we document significant unlearning during the pandemic, meaning that it's not only that many children made less progress than one would have hoped that they made, but they actually, for some, their skills actually decreased. Okay, which is a horrible result, and really, really alarming. It seems quite clear from our results that, as one would expect, long school closures are highly detrimental, and as a consequence, homeschooling is key for mitigating harmful impacts of school closures. In terms of looking at the family structure and their characteristics, we saw that losses are highly concentrated among children from poorer families. Okay, and we also saw that these losses are highly concentrated among those children who are the most literate at baseline, before the pandemic started. And so I'm going to conclude by a few things that we think we can interpret from our results, but we very much appreciate your thoughts and comments on our results and on our interpretations. So in our view, our results tell us that pandemic impacts are strongly shaped by factors at various levels, and that includes the school level, the household level, and also the child level. They all matter strongly for the pandemic's impacts on education. Another implication of our finding seems to be that the impacts in terms of literacy were particularly detrimental for good students from poor households. Okay, and that's a worrying finding, because in our view that suggests that the pandemic actually undoes some of the equality impacts that formal schooling can actually deliver, as we know. And that means that if we zoom out a little bit more, that means that our results actually suggest that the pandemic is not an equalizer, as some had hoped at some time in the beginning of the pandemic, but in fact, the impacts actually reinforce structural disadvantages and inequality among in societies and among disadvantaged households compared to less disadvantaged households. Okay, I'll stop there, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Your results are really disturbing. I think they're also consistent with what we're seeing here in the United States, for example, similar kinds of patterns where you're actually seeing, at least from the descriptive analysis, some of the same results that you report right at the end, that the pandemic exacerbates education inequality, or productivity inequality, unfortunately. So we have to come up with some ways to overcome this in the long run. All right, so we had 3 really interesting presentations. Thanks all of you to keeping to the schedule and for being so clear in your presentations. So now what I'll do is open it up for questions. We'll have about 10 minutes for each one, and then can have a general discussion. I'll start with Eugenia's paper, and I just want to start off with just a question. Your data is not coming up to the very recent period, but it seems that we're seeing right now a lot of Russian return migration, or new Russians entering. And I'm just wondering whether any of these labor market policies that you're looking at are going to be able to help these new immigrants integrate into the labor market in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, thank you for a question. And yeah, actually, the issue of returning migrants is now being discussed also in Kyrgyzstan, and I know that there is concern. Also, like now, especially because now the Ministry of the Ministry of Labor has been undergoing several reshufflings during the last years, and now last year, finally, now we have the Minister of Migration, Social Protection, and Minister of Labor, Social Protection and Migration. So migration used to be under the State Migration Service, and now it's, well, it kind of upgraded to the status of ministry. So the migration policy now is kind of under the Ministry of Labor. And I know that there is in the new strategy, which has not been approved yet, this national program for employment promotion 2022-2026, there is a point about returning migrants, and I know that there are programs that, like, pilots, some organizations are thinking about reintegration programs. There is also the main issue is that for now is the registration. So if for accessing these labor market policies that I have very quickly allocated that are provided by the Public Employment Service, you need to be registered as unemployed, and you need to be eligible for participation in this either passive or active support measures. And this registration thing is actually it's very restrictive in the sense that people need to prove that they have been kind of legally employed for some time, for 6 months continuously within the last 3 years. And this is something that many people who work in the informal sector, for example, cannot prove. And then there is the issue of people that have a plot of land, for example, that are not eligible for these support policies, more than 5 hectares. And actually, when I talk to employees at the employment centers, that were saying that many people that come to the employment office to register as unemployed, they don't even know that they have this land, because many times, especially in the southern regions of Kyrgyzstan, people are like in the family, when a male member of the family is born, like he's granted this plot of land, and he might not even know that he has this land. And then when he goes to this kind of state offices, and they have now this very kind of new and way to find out whether this person has or not land, because they have this connection with the cadastre. And so many people are surprised because they didn't know that that land, that plot was like in their own possession, not in the family, for example. So that there are this kind of structural, this kind of impediments, and for returning migrants, that might be even more complicated, and also it's not very clear at this point how many migrants also will return from Russia, because at the beginning, when the war started, there were very gloomy hypotheses about returning migrants of 100,000s. But for now, as far as I know, I'm not really into migration, but as far as I know, that this has not happened. So many migrants still go to Russia to work. So this return wave is not materialized. But one of the, so that's why one of the questions also would be to widen the scope of these active labor market policies, and to widen the eligibility criteria, so that not only the officially registered unemployed can access these services, but also returning migrants and actually, I know that now that I think about it, there is now in the new information system that the Public Employment Service have, there is now the possibility to, when they register a person, to indicate whether he or she is a returning migrant or not. So they have this kind of option so that this can be recorded. But as of now, there are no like targeted policy for returning migrants. So they can register, and you can see that they have the statistics of like, okay, this person is a returning migrant, this unemployed, but there are no tailor-made programs that are specifically addressing these migrants. There was this program, not sure if it started already, this Mekinim Kyrgyzstan, which was actually about these loans for returning migrants to help them open up their businesses on the model of the Moldovan kind of program, reintegration program, but I'm not sure this has been started already. So I think the main issue for these active labor market policies would be to have a wider scope and on the one hand and on the other hand to have more tailor-made to specific groups. And now that there are some pilot projects for persons with disability, for example, or for youth, and returning migrants should also be targeted by these policies. But this there needs to be a change also in the law and in the eligibility criteria, in my opinion.
Right. Thank you. And of course, none of these programs would apply to the new Russians who are coming in. But I'm assuming, because you said that the return migration is not very large, that they're finding pretty good labor market opportunities during the war up in Russia. Maybe as more people are drafted to the military, more jobs will open up. So it's not going to cause as much of a return as expected.
Yeah, I think that there is this, well, first of all, the Russians that are now fleeing and that are in Central Asia, well, if you're not, you need to have a registration if you want to access some services. And employment services, well, we need also to underline that the unemployment benefits in Kyrgyzstan, the maximum unemployment benefit is 800 soms, which is, I don't know now the exchange rate, but it's around $15 maybe. So it's per month. So it's not very, I don't know how to say it, but in English, but like it's not really attractive. And also the active policies, they are very limited. There are some good vocational trainings, but first of all, I have doubts that there is this, they would be eligible to take part. And about the migrants who stay in Russia, of course, like there is this the loss of income, and many lost their jobs first for the pandemic, and many went back to Kyrgyzstan during the pandemic, and then they left for Russia again. Then the war started. So there is, of course, loss of income because many lost their job, their like primary job. But then there are always some kind of strategies or finding other kind of jobs or moving to another city. And I think that it's kind of going to be more a long-term probably shift. And the first reaction, I think, was also to wait for many of them, because they actually know that the situation at home is not good. But the government is trying to widen the migration opportunities. So there's trying to also sign agreements with countries for this kind of organized migration. So like in the summer, there was this first program for seasonal works in the UK. And now I've heard that there is also this trying to make an agreement with Finland Italy. So they're trying to kind of diversify the migration routes, but this takes time, I think.
Well, the UI unemployment insurance benefits are so low that it's no wonder nobody applies. I mean, your take up is really, really low. So you don't offer anything, it's not worth it to even apply. It's too costly. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments for Eugenia? Damir?
Yeah, Eugenia, just wanted to comment in this environment when there seems to be policy but very underfunded. What's your intention in terms of your research? Meaning, would you come up with something that works? We were quite pessimistic. We had a whole project about gender and employment, and this is exactly facts that you described. We learned as well, and we were kind of okay. There's countries that similarly has policy, but doesn't really work at all. Maybe active labor market policies have potential, but in terms of unemployment benefits, given that informality whole is not declining, there seems to be really very little hope that there is will be policy impact. Yeah, maybe shortly you can comment, but it may be just a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Damir. Actually, yeah, first of all, I would be really interested to learn about your research about gender and employment. And secondly, well, I think that one of my hypotheses is that these active labor market policies, as I said at the beginning, were designed for different kind of economies, and the whole employment support institution, the whole employment support policy is. I have my impression and my observation is that it's really designed for another kind of economy and another kind of country, and so I'm trying to look at this activation framework within this the kind of informality lens. So to see, because I think that what kind of is left out is the informal employment, because they're not covered. And when you have a country like Kyrgyzstan, where 70%, according to recent studies, 70% of the employed people are employed in the informal economy, I think that so the policies that are designed should also take into account informality, and I would try to see actually what happens on the ground. So I've been doing some interviews with some experts in NGOs and policymakers, but also with these employees in employment centers, and asking what are your strategies? And what I put in the last slides about the opportunities is that there is a lot of know-how at the kind of street level, at the local level, at the office level. And there are people that have been working in these institutions for many years, for even from the 90s. And probably there should be a different approach. I don't know which one. And I hope in my research, and I'm trying really to find out how people make sense of this, how people that are tasked to implement these policies try to adapt the policies to the realities on the ground. So, for example, I know that there is a lot of informal networks, especially in the smaller, but even in Bishkek, like people working in the employment centers, they know directly, personally, I don't know, companies and employers, and they try to help as they can in a very informal way. So I think that's because the market itself is very informal. So I think that I will try to look at it through the kind of this informality studies and try to include the informal employment and see, I mean, what are the solutions that are found on the ground by practitioners and also by people by the unemployed who make their strategies. And I also think there is also this kind of very initial understanding of unemployment, which probably needs to be reconsidered, and who is unemployed and who is not, and how do you define it? Because even like unemployed in Kyrgyzstan, this official unemployed, which is very, very low, it tells a lot about how people see themselves. And because many of those who are registered, they are working somewhere because they cannot live on the benefits. So they're not unemployed, they're informally employed. So what does it mean to be unemployed then? So I will try to kind of make this bigger picture, hopefully.
Any other questions for Eugenia? Okay, let's move on to Tanika's paper on migration. I guess I'll just sort of, along the same lines of what I asked Eugenia, your data go only through 2013, so we've got almost another decade since your study completes its analysis, and you didn't look at 2016. Do you think that your models have changed any since the 2013 endpoint of your analysis? And do you see that any of this new migration in from Russia is going to make any differences on temporary outmigration from Kyrgyz families? Or do you see any connection between this inflow of Russians and currently employed Kyrgyz?
Yeah, so the 2013 is basically when we started this project, and we did not have access to 2016 data, and so at that point we did not include. But I think generally the implications or the findings of our paper, I don't think it will change by adding another year. That's one. The second is this implies that temporary migration to Russia is a very important means of mitigating income shocks in Kyrgyzstan, right? So I don't know the exact context now, but I would imagine that if, because of the current conditions, if this going to and fro from Russia, so either you go one side, you stay back in Russia because you cannot come back, or you are not able to go. So both are worrisome, right? Because what we find is that if there is an income shock, these people need to go to Russia to mitigate the income shocks. But at the same time, if there is a labor shock at home, they need to also come back and help the family. So if this mobility is restricted because of the current situation, that's going to be difficult for the households back in Kyrgyzstan. So I don't remember your second question, Latif.
I was just asking whether you thought that your models would need to be adjusted in more recent period. There are been a lot of changes. So, you know, war is just one other, you know, global difficulties and global problems are shocks that affect households, not just this one thing, but that's a major one in the region. Do you think that if you had data up through the current period that you would adopt your model in some different way?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing that would be important also to look at is that, so suppose the destination country, so in this particular case, the movement to, we are considering international migration only to Russia because that's the biggest chunk of it, right? Now, consider a situation where the destination country actually receives an economic shock. I mean, global shocks are everywhere, right? But some countries receive more than, or are affected more than others. are they able to change the destination countries for their migration when they receive these shocks? That would be, I think, perhaps an important question to ask. And if not, how can policies, or how can we, I mean, what can policies do to basically address that situation? So, for instance, absence of so what we find is that there is an absence of labor market, household labor market, right? Sorry, an absence of market for household labor within Kyrgyzstan, because of which the migrants have to come back. So one of the policy implications is that can the government do something about, or can something be done about fostering a market for household labor where households are anyway quite poor, so that the much needed migration need not stop, right? It need not constrain. Similarly, when there is so that's about a home country shock. Similarly, when there's a destination country shock, like you said about the financial crisis, etc., the current situations or more recent situations, can we think of, when you cannot provide employment locally and migration is a very important means of livelihood, can we think of other potential locations that people can move to, also at cheaper cost, that we have to keep in mind? Or what can be options? I think that those are the questions that need to be looked at. Or what are these people doing actually if mobility has become so difficult to Russia, or the conditions in Russia have become so much more difficult? What are they doing as alternative means of mitigation?
Definitely a role for policy, right?
Yeah.
Virginia?
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question for Tanika about the migration?
If I may make a few short comments. So, Tanika, thank you. It's really very interesting work, and I look forward to its completion or maybe extension. Just to add that in addition to 2016, we collected data in 2019. So if you really want, all waves are now available in the same place. So in terms of data access, it's not a question. That one particular question you asked about migrants returning home in winter and doing some repair work or collecting something. It's been quite typical for migrants to come home around New Year. Yeah, it's a time when they come and join families. But I doubt that they would do renovation or repairs at home because it's cold and most of the parts of the country is cold and it's not really time to do that type of work. But rather it would be more or less those people, migrants, would work in construction sector in Russia, for example, coming back because in winters in Russia even colder. So usually my understanding was that this type of workers are back and spend some time at home before spring. So that's possibly changed after the country entered this Eurasian Economic Union, when Kyrgyz migrants got much more better working conditions, meaning they were practically equalized in terms of rights. So we hear that many people move to services sector like trade and much more formal type of jobs. So that maybe changed the pattern of return temporary migration, but to be looked upon. But yeah, probably that's the only comment I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Damir, first of all, for informing me about this conference, of course. Otherwise, I would not have known to submit my paper. The second is, yeah, that's a very important point that you make, because I was not fully aware of the situation, of the local situation in Kyrgyzstan. I talked to Bak once about this and to understand the labor requirements. But what we really pick up is not construction work. I think we need to dig a little deeper based on what you said for the next rounds. What we pick up is time use within the household. And we do find that adult members of the household spend much more time in winters in labor-intensive work, like repairs of house, like other kinds of Yeah, so mainly household repairs. I think that was the question in the survey. Yeah. So possible, and the sense that I got from BAK was that in rural Kyrgyzstan, heating within the household is not very prevalent. So if there are coal shocks, then households need to also arrange for that heating, coal or whatever it is. That's why I thought that this could be the ones that explains why when there is a particular winter shock, not every winter, the return in January, every winter is perfectly understandable, but why when there is a cold shock, then there is return migration, then the return migration increases. That's what we were trying to, but yeah, I think I should, because the time use survey that you have in Ilaike is very interesting. So I think much more can be done with that. Yeah, I think Elnara has a question.
Yes, I do. I don't really know much about migration. It's not my specialty, but I was wondering. I think, as I understood right, during the summer times, the migration increased to foreign countries. So and it did affect the. So the migration was higher during the summer time. Is that right?
So basically, the migration happens particularly in summer is agriculture time, remember. So it happens particularly in October, August, September, that time, October.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit interesting to see that pattern in your study, because this is the time where you actually expect the like in the rural area, the farmers actually to stay and kind of take care of their own household. But instead, what we see is actually the people migrate. So I just wonder why do these migrants actually migrate?
Yeah.
Why do they stay inside the country and actually work on a more like a green and circular economies? Do we have some policies in Kyrgyzstan that actually make for these farmers attracted to stay within the country rather than, for example, make them migrate and losing our human capital elsewhere?
Yeah, you make a very important point, Elnara. You say that these are the months when agriculture is most important, right? The farmers need to work on agriculture. And what we show is exactly in these months, when there is a negative agricultural shock so that their income falls and they don't have much agriculture to do or to bank on, that is when they use migration as an insurance mechanism. Now, what you are saying is that that's a larger question, I think, that whether there should be policies or there can be policies, there should be policies to enable these people to stay back and do the agriculture rather than migrate out and provide labor in some other country. Now, migration historically has been shown to be a very important part of development. Right, so it's not entirely clear whether this out-migration is a bad thing or a good thing, because there is remittance money, there is overall increase in household income, etc. So whether this is more efficient for the local economy is not, or not, I think that's a much bigger question to ask, but it's a very important question nonetheless.
Yeah, I think what I can add to that is that although Kyrgyzstan strive to have green economies, what we see right now in rural areas is that we do negatively affected by the climate change. We see some droughts in the rural areas. We don't see a good, for example, the irrigation systems. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it's not good for our social sustainability, but it does well. It do well for the economy, but not necessarily for the sustainable economy, not necessarily for the circular economy, but more for the growth economy, which is not really sustainable in the long term. Yeah. So I think it's just a comment.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the comments on the last paper for comments for Wolfgang. I'll just start off with the one minor comment. You show that people who have knowledge of someone who had COVID or died from COVID, that you experienced a decline in literacy. Why? I mean, this is not actual experience with COVID. You don't know whether the person's in the household, or is it more of a community-based health problem that you're observing? Fear, what's the logic behind that?
Thank you, Catherine. That's a very good question, obviously. So we observe a drop for both groups, right? But the drop is larger for those who were exposed to that. As you say, one explanation could be more like the social environment. Another one could be that it makes households directly more vulnerable, right? And relatedly, it could also be the case that in case that's a relative or a friend, that they need to devote time to, providing care to that person, right? And as a consequence, it might be the case that they can spend less time on, homeschooling and these kind of activities. But yeah, it's a really good question, and we should try to dig into that a bit deeper.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the data don't allow you to figure out who has it, or you would have asked whether your parents were sick or, a sibling or something like that. But anyway, it's interesting. Anybody else have some questions for Wolfgang or Damir on this paper? Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a very quick question. I think what you showed is, although the data comes from Kyrgyzstan, it's a phenomenon, as Kathy was saying, also in the US, but all countries, right? So it's much wider in terms of its implications than just Kyrgyzstan. I just had one question about the policy implications that you mentioned, that one of the way out is possibly homeschooling. And, yeah, that's of course something very important, but then it comes to which you also find, right, that the strongest effects, negative effects, are for the most vulnerable families, and where the parents are essentially not educated. So I'm not sure whether this, unfortunately, can be a way out at all. So maybe we need to think harder to come to right policy decisions. Yeah.
Thank you, Tanika. That's an excellent question. So what we show is that homeschooling can mitigate some of these adverse impacts, but as you say, the scope of actually, the scope for policy here might actually be quite limited because of the constraints that you mentioned, right? So I wonder if that means that we might need to think about other solutions, right, to provide schooling in a different way, yeah, which could be a sort of a community-based form of schooling, right, based on social networks. But this is just a thought. But this is that's an excellent observation. Thank you.
I know one thing that one thing in my community that's popped up in the last year, because again, we're seeing some similar things here locally. The most vulnerable are the most affected. But they started a massive volunteer tutoring program for children. So it's volunteer, so it's not costing them in terms of they don't have to pay anybody to do it. So I've participated in that. Do you think anything like that would work in Kyrgyzstan?
I think that's an excellent idea, but we should ask Damir, who knows the Kyrgyz context a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I've been living in Europe for a long time, so sometimes I feel I cannot really claim I know, but I'm in Bishkek now, so probably a question to ask people around. I doubt that this type of volunteering would work. Even parents wouldn't be able to help their kids despite of being like having secondary education. So there is a kind of cultural, societal expectations that it's teachers' obligation to teach their kids, and it's not theirs. So from the other side, in terms of volunteering, kind of mass volunteering, it's amazingly very salient, yeah, very visible, and then some shocks happen, especially the social unrest and etc. So in that respect, could be that this behavior also could be applied, and maybe that's an excellent idea to discuss. And I trust if it's online mode, it's not only Kyrgyz in the country, but many young who are outside could be even doing that. That's something to share this idea. Thank you.
Eugenia, you had a question?
Yeah, just a small question. Well, thank you, Wolfgang, for the presentation. Actually, I just wanted to ask if you had also the possibility in your questions, in your research, to ask about the access to some forms of technology, because I know that like homeschooling has been an issue everywhere, but in Kyrgyzstan, I guess in many other countries, but one of the also kind of the first barriers was that many kids and many households didn't have access to internet and elementarily like to also, and how these schools themselves adapted to this pandemic situation. So that also, I think it also plays a role in the fact in kind of increasing the kind of inequalities, because if you have possibility to attend online, or if the school provides you with this possibility, or if you don't have this possibility, that's also quite, it actually worsens even more this divide.
Thank you, Eugenia. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a key constraint. Based on our data, no, I mean, we ask for assets. Do they have a TV? Do they have a smartphone? If I remember correctly, the majority of people do have, for example, a TV. They have smartphones. They use WhatsApp a lot. Yeah, it is definitely a constraint, but I wonder if it's not that big a constraint in the context. But I'm not sure, Damir, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, what I can say at the peak of the COVID and all these lockdowns, they were really concerned about this inequality when poor households, they might have devices, but internet, and so especially mobile internet, would be costly. So that was definitely a constraint from funding point of view. But yeah, I agree with Wolfgang. It looked like both households might have decent access if needed to online and TV-based education.
I have a question from Adina.
Good evening. I do not really have a question, but I would like to note, like just a small note regarding the technical tools in mobile phones for homeschooling in Kyrgyzstan. Based on the current research we have been doing with school teachers for the last like half a year now, we have a question regarding the COVID effects on the education quality and how it affect the families in general. And I can say that 1/3 of the teachers who we interviewed and surveyed mentioned that one of the biggest challenges was the lack of mobile phones for children. And even if they have the mobile phones, for families with several kids, they have like 2 mobile phones, and which is not enough for, let's say, a family which has at least 3 or 4 school students. So it was just a kind of small note that Eugenia also mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you, Adina. I think it emphasizes the point that the 2 levels are actually important here. One is the parent level and one is the child level. And I think we were best to talk about the parent level. But of course, the child level is very important too. So thanks a lot.
Well, if there are no other questions, then this session is over. Thank you all the presenters for very good papers, interesting papers.